Okay. Well, good morning, everybody, and enjoy a good sunny Friday. I'm Kelly Feehan. I'm an extension educator with UNL. I'm in Columbus, Nebraska, and I've been in this position about 38 years. My background is I have a degree in horticulture, but my focus was arboriculture. So I love trees, and I love teaching master gardeners, others, and especially youth about trees. Today's topic is, the title was Trees to Replace Ash Trees. I'm going to be talking about shade trees to plant, and whether you're replacing an ash tree, another tree that's been lost, or you, which definitely should be done, or planting a new tree in a new site. So trees, as you know, are vital community assets. I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir, but we know the many benefits: economic, energy conservation, ecosystem services like stormwater mitigation is being focused on more, as well as habitats for wildlife like songbirds and even pollinators, and just the social aspects. It's so much nicer to live in communities with good tree canopy, and communities need tree canopy, and by that I mean tall trees that are relatively long-lived and weather ready. Okay, and there's a little bit of a trend towards planting shorter trees. So many communities are losing tree canopy, and most of us that enjoy trees, we want to reverse that because they are vital community assets. So the goal is a diverse forest, so variety of trees, especially genus, and not that monoculture planting. We all know what's happened with the American elm, and now what's happening or will soon be happening with our ash trees. So by diverse, we mean just planting a variety of different trees. Quality trees, I'll try to talk about that a little bit more as we go on what's viewed as a quality tree. And good structure. Some trees naturally have good structure. I'm not going to talk about pruning today, but correct pruning, probably in the first 10 to 20 years of a tree's life, depending on how fast it grows, is key in many cases to getting that good structure. So we want to replace those lost trees, like ash trees, with the right trees. So my focus today is select right and plant right. And before I start talking about trees to plant, I have to go a little bit into how to avoid the common mistakes and how to plant it correctly. Because we can select the best tree in the world. However, if we make some of these common mistakes and we don't plant it correctly, it may not turn out to be the best tree in the world. It likely will not live up to its potential. So I know there's a lot of wording on here, and I'm not going to go in too much detail on each one, but avoid some of these common mistakes. Do deal with girdling roots or buy differently. And what I mean by buying differently is the nursery industry is starting to recognize, you know, that issue of trees growing in plastic containers, at least for too long or too large a trees, and the circling roots. So, you know, you can buy a smaller tree, you can buy bare roots, or some of the newer methods that the nurseries are using, like these root trapper bag here, and just cut down the side. But what they do basically is they have air holes so the roots can grow through and be air pruned. So instead of starting to hit the side of a plastic container and grow in a circle. So you get this nice fibrous root system shown in the photo below it, instead of these root systems with heavily circling roots. Okay, don't plant too deep, and this is a major issue, so next couple slides, I'm gonna go into that more in depth, because why pick a great tree and then plant it too deep so it has issues. Don't amend the backfill soil. As master gardeners, you've heard this. The same soil you take out of the hole, put that native soil back in, because we don't want to encourage, you don't want to make the hole too cushy so the roots just keep growing in a circle in that hole, as a possibility. Don't prune at planting. There's lots of stored food in those branches. Those branches are going to produce leaves for photosynthesis, and all those things are needed for that tree to get established, as well as overcome some transplanting shock. So unless if you have a broken branch or a dead branch, it's okay to prune those off. Maybe a double leader, but even double leaders you might leave for a year, but don't leave them too long. As a general rule, we say don't fertilize with nitrogen at planting. Most soils are fertile enough for tree growth, especially if you're planting into a lawn that's fertilized, okay? But if too much nitrogen at planting, we might burn those tender roots. We might promote top growth at the expense of rooting. Don't stake too high or too long. And I know these are a little bit smaller photos, but the picture in the bottom is how we recommend staking. And the key thing to remember with staking a young tree you just plant is the whole goal is to keep the root ball from shifting in the soil. We want the trunk to move with the wind because it has to move with the wind its whole life. That's how it develops its resistance to wind. And movement of the trunk promotes growth hormones that helps the root to get established. And also trees where the trunk can move, you get better caliper or stronger trunk sooner. So you're trying to prevent the root ball from shifting in the soil. You're not trying to stop the trunk from swaying with the wind. So this taking a stake and putting it in diagonally towards the base of the tree, wrapping with a wide material, and do it for about 1 year. And water correctly without overwatering. By correctly, I mean keep the soil moist about 8 to 12 inches deep and at least 2 feet outside the planting hole because those roots grow out, not necessarily down. If you go much deeper than 8 to 12 inches, you're wasting water. And don't wait 20 years to prune until a major issue is developed if you want to have good structure. So 2 more slides before I get into tree selection. You don't want to buy a great tree and then plant it too deep. And this is a very common problem. So the picture on the left shows a tree that's been planted correctly. You can see that nice trunk taper. Picture on the left, it was planted too deep. It looks like a telephone pole going into the ground. This tree is going to be more stressed over its lifetime. It'll likely have a shorter lifespan. There's a belief that these trees could be more susceptible to wind toss. So we don't want to plant too deep. How do you plant at the correct depth? Well, don't, in most cases, plant at the same depth the tree was in the container. This might be just fine. But first, here's a great picture I got from the Nebraska Forest Service presentation. This was a tree, okay, you want to find the trunk taper, the first lateral root. On younger trees, it might be hard to see the trunk taper, so look for that first lateral root coming off. And this particular tree, it's a very, very large tree to be planting, but whether it was balled and burlapped or whether it was in a container, that's how deep it was in the container. So if we'd planted at the same depth it was in the container, it'd be a good foot too deep already. And then many people, I shouldn't say us, many people will dig the hole even deeper. So this tree could have ended up 1.5 feet too deep, maybe. So wait to dig a planting hole until you find that trunk taper, that first lateral root. So in the container, just take it out of the container and push back that soil until you find that first strong lateral root. When you're doing that, you're going to be removing some fibrous roots, but that's okay. And then you plant it so that root flare or that trunk taper, that root flare is just below the soil grade or just slightly above it. If you have a heavier clay soil, we say to plant 1 to 2 inches above the soil grade. So here's a good diagram from Kansas State. Again, find that trunk taper first. Don't ever dig the hole until you find it, and then only dig the hole just deep enough so that taper will be just below or just above. You want to always set the root ball on very firm, undisturbed soil. And people have the idea that I have to dig deeper and loosen that soil so my roots will grow down, but they don't grow down. Most of them grow out. Okay, so dig a wider hole. Okay. So the recommendation is 2 to 5 times the diameter of the root ball. 5 times might be a bit much in some situations. That would be ideal, but at least go 2 times wider. So I always tell people, instead of putting your energy and your effort and your sweat into digging a deep hole, just put it into digging a wider hole. Okay, now that we are reminded on how to plant a tree correctly, let's get into tree selection. So a quality tree, when people come to me, this is what they want. What's a fast-growing tree that won't be messy and has great fall color? And I kind of go, yikes. And those characteristics are very understandable that people want those, but they can lead us astray. And they often lead us astray into selecting a tree that might not be considered a quality tree. We know fast-growing trees, especially very fast-growing trees, are the ones that have softer wood, sometimes more brittle wood, and might be more susceptible to ice and wind damage. By not messy, most people think, I don't want it to have any fruit. And I'll be honest with you, this is my pet peeve. I like fruit on trees, messy or not. And I understand where people are coming from, but this is a character we might have to deal with it as the tree gets older, and maybe for a couple of weeks or a month out of the year. You know, sometimes it's, in my opinion, it's worth dealing with it, and I don't view all fruit as messy. Fall color is a great characteristic to look for, but it shouldn't be the only one. So there's many trees. We can come pretty close to what people want. There are many trees that are better than others. And I think we'd be surprised, a lot of trees that are perceived as slow growing, if we start with a little younger tree, we don't plant it too deep, we avoid those common mistakes, I think we'd all be pleasantly surprised at how fast they actually grow. So I tell people, you know, look, I give people a list of trees. I've kind of broken my list into good to great trees, you know, good trees, but overplanted, you know, and trees to avoid. But on that list of good to great trees and good trees, I tell them, just look at the good and bad points, you know, and select a site-adapted tree whose good points you want or need, and you can live with any bad points. And I always emphasize that one person's bad point might be another person's good point. So for me, I like tree fruits, but a lot of people might view that as a bad point. Okay. I always be aware of trees to avoid. And in my opinion, that would be a very fast growing tree because they tend to be softer wooded with more brittle wood. Trees that are prone to any serious pest issues. Every plant can get a pest issue, but some of them are more serious than others. So ask at the nursery garden center, ask your local extension educator. Often I'll tell people, once you narrow your tree down to 2 or 3 that you want to buy, give me a call back and I can kind of tell you the pros and cons locally of that tree. And of course, overplanted trees. I'll often tell people when they call me, I'll say, well, look around the neighborhood and what you see a lot of, don't plant those trees. Pick something else. So this is Kelly's opinion, and I think most people would agree with this, but trees to avoid in home landscapes. And I tell people to definitely avoid those on the left. I'm not going to go into detail on these or why I recommend that, because I want to get on to the good trees to plant. And in my opinion, the definitely think twice are trees that should be avoided too. There's some situations and some people that might be willing to put up with some of the issues. But I would definitely think twice and prefer to avoid these trees. And if you're wondering about any of them in particular, feel free to chat that and I can address it. These are good trees, maybe even great trees, but they're overplanted. Good to great trees, but they are overplanted. So we're not telling people not to plant these, but realize that they are overplanted, and some of them can have some issues. To me, these are some great but underplanted trees, and these are the trees that I'm going to talk about going forward. So I will dive right into those. The oaks. I think almost all foresters would like to see more oaks planted. People perceive them as very slow growing, but again, start with a small tree and plant it correctly, and you might be even amazed at how fast some of these oaks can grow. There's great oaks, such as the ones down below where I say we need more of. Yeah, there's some okay oaks. So we definitely need fewer to none of pin oak because of the chlorosis problem, and swamp white oak. The picture I have is a swamp white oak here in Columbus with that iron chlorosis. So oaks in that red oak family are sensitive to our high pH soils in the Great Plains, and sometimes we can see chlorosis. In my experience, pin and swamp white are probably the worst. So there is that red oak group, and then there's the white oak group, and I'll cover a few in each. Acorns, that's another one. I don't want to plant an oak tree because of the acorns. They're messy. Well, they're great for wildlife. They're only there for maybe a month out of the year. And some of these trees can take years. I mean, even up to 30, 25, 30, even 40 years before they really start to produce much. So, and what I'm talking about today are not the only trees to plant, but they're the ones I've selected to share. So red oak, most of the trees I'm covering are native to both Nebraska and Iowa. Most of them are extreme southeast Nebraska. So Iowa, you're a little luckier. They're native across the entire state. But if it's not native, I also mention that because I know there's some people that just prefer to go the native route, and that's okay. So of the red oaks, the red oak compared, pin oak is, people like pin oak because it grew probably one of the fastest oaks, but it has that issue of chlorosis. So we don't recommend it anymore at all. So red oak will have fast growth rate, again, if we plant correctly. It's great red fall color. And once established, it's one that's very tolerant of drought, dry soil. You're probably wondering, aren't they the same thing? Not necessarily. You can have a site, this tree in this picture is in a park in Columbus, and that's a continuously dry site for the most part because it's a city park, so they don't irrigate. But in the years that we get adequate rainfall, it performs very, very well. So a drought tolerant tree would be a tree that when we get one of those severe droughts like 2012, can be tolerant of those conditions as well. And this is an oak that's fairly good for sandy soil. Our park in Columbus is right next, practically next to our Loop River, so it's very sandy. And notice, this can take up to 40 years to produce an abundant acorn crop. Black oak, this is one I'm not very familiar with, but I keep hearing we should plant more black oak. So I planted one last fall. So time will tell on how well it does. And I started with about a 3-foot tall tree, which seems to work the smaller with oaks because they can be a little bit more difficult to transplant, but not too bad. It's called a black oak because the mature bark is a little blackish. This one has yellow to yellow-brown fall color, so it won't have the nice reds that we see with the red oak. It is tolerates those poor dry soils. It is a little bit lower drought tolerance than red oak, but it's still pretty good. And you can see it is in that red oak group, so the leaf is very similar to a red oak. Shumard oak, now this is one that's not native, just an FYI for those of you that prefer to go the native route. It's very similar to red oak, especially in habit and leaf shape, that nice glossy leaf. Moderately fast growth rate, so pretty equivalent to red oak. Note that it is zone 5. So some of you that are up in northern Iowa, or I mean, I'm in Columbus and we are zone 5, but you go about 30 miles north and we hit zone 4. So even in Columbus, we're pretty close to that zone 4 mark. This one has good heat and drought tolerance, and this is an oak that will tolerate wet soils. Okay, so if you happen to have a location where it's a little bit lower, we get rainy, wet years, they stay a little wetter, maybe not as well drained, or nurserymen, I've had nursery people tell me that I won't sell that tree to homeowners because they turn their automatic irrigation systems on and they never shut it off, and that tree just can't tolerate that continuously wet soil. So we should just be shutting our automatic irrigation systems off rather than buying trees that will tolerate that, but just an FYI. And this one will have that nice, reliable red fall color, and it'll start producing acorns a little younger than a red oak. Okay, on to the white oak group. Bur oak is probably one of highly native across Nebraska as well. It's a very stately tree, can become quite large. You know, so may not be the best tree for a smaller yard. You need a large yard, maybe a city park, school property. They're a little bit they're considered coarse textured because the bark is darker, and the twigs, the branches will often have kind of a quirky wing on them, which I think adds interest. It's a tough tree that's adaptable to many different soils. It's probably our most drought tolerant oak. It does not have any fall color, and that's probably the one downfall of it and the reason why some people will not select it, but it's a very awesome stately oak that is worth planting. The acorns, this one, I put in a picture of the acorn because it's known, a nickname of this tree is mossy cup oak, because as you can see that cup that covers the nut kind of looks like it is covered with moss. White oaks, another tough oak. That's another large, stately oak. This is, going to be a slower growing oak. The white oaks as a rule will grow slower than the red oaks. Okay. So, but this one's going to be probably slower even than Bur Oak. Very tough tree, tolerant of drought, clay soils, shallow rocky soils, and dry soils. The fall color, you can see the picture here, it is pretty, but it's kind of an orangey brown. So they're really more of a brown. In the good fall color years that they might be a little reddish. Chinkapin oak. We don't see this one as much, but it is a native. This one is hardy to zone 5, just an FYI. It prefers moist loams. I always kind of laugh at myself when I put that in there because, you know, it's a big league statement, but I think I can say all trees prefer moist loam. Once established, it's drought tolerant, but they're not noted as doing as well in consistently dry soils. Yellow to brown fall color. Again, most oaks up to 30 years to bear acorns. It almost looks, sometimes it's called a chestnut oak can be, because it doesn't have the typical lobes that a lot of our oak trees have. Okay, and I'll be honest with you, I took this picture at the Pierce Arboretum and it actually has some herbicide damage on it, but you can still get a good sense of the leaf shape and the glossiness of the leaves. Large tree, there is a dwarf chinkapin, which is fairly common in the market. So, you know, if you want the tall shade tree, be sure you're getting the right the right species. Dwarf chinkapin is more shrub-like, and it can be a prolific acorn producer at a very young age. So if your goal is to plant it in an area where you want to have the acorns, and you don't need a tall shade tree, dwarf chinkapin is a very good, tough tree. Okay, enough on those are the oaks. Recommending, there's others. Yes?
Kelly, we do have a question, and I thought when we went between the tree species, we'd do it.
Right. Yep.
So Linda asks, why should black locust trees be avoided?
They're kind of a weedy tree. They're thorny, not real long thorns like some of the honey locusts that have thorns. And they also are starting to be considered invasive in a number of different states. And they're very fast growing. They have beautiful they have a beautiful bloom that almost looks like wisteria. And that's sometimes why people are attracted to them. Now, if you have any of those trees planted, keep them. But there's better quality trees that we can plant for a large shade tree. Okay, but I mainly put them, I used to have them on the think twice list, but because they are becoming considered invasive in so many states, I kind of moved them over to the avoid list. I like black locust. We have them in our city parks here in Columbus, and I like to see them in bloom. They're a fun tree, but they're not necessarily a quality tree. So I hope that helps. Okay, maples. Everybody wants a maple. That's kind of a big leg statement. I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people buy a new home and I want to plant a maple. So the genus is, for that reason, the genus itself is becoming overplanted. But I'm still recommending some here. Just like the oaks, there's good and there's not so good. There's fast-growing maples versus slow-growing maples. The fast-growing ones like silver tend to be weak-wooded. Our slower-growing ones hard-wooded. So selection is kind of key to quality with maples. We see chlorosis. It's usually manganese chlorosis. It can be iron as well, but I see it mainly in the reds and the silvers, where you have a high pH soil. In my opinion, we need fewer silver. The Freeman maples like Autumn Blaze, I know people cringe when I say that because a lot of people love Autumn Blaze for the beautiful fall color, but they're not considered a quality tree. Others would disagree with me on the red. Red is a decent tree, but they are pretty highly overplanted. So I think we need more of the sugar, black, and Miyabei. These aren't perfect. I don't know that I would call these perfect trees. There can be some challenges with growing them. Sugar maple is the one where we're going to get probably the best fall color. That's why people go to Vermont, Maine. They go to the Northeast. It's to see the sugar maples in bloom and other trees. So they have excellent fall color. This is what I'm showing you are pictures I took at our local park here in Columbus. sugar maple can be a challenge because it's not as adapted to our hot, dry summers, and they're not well adapted to compacted soils. They do tolerate shade. So cultivar selection is very important, and I list there some of the cultivars that we do recommend for Nebraska. So if they're recommended for Nebraska, I'm sure they'll do just fine in Iowa where it's native. Cato and Fall Fiesta are highly touted. Table Rock is actually a selection from Nebraska, Table Rock, Nebraska. Green Mountain has been around for quite a while. We have a number of these in our park in Columbus, and they are doing fine. And then Legacy and Wright Brothers. So they probably should just be planted in a somewhat protected location. You don't want to put them on the top of the hill in open, exposed, very windy site. But you'll be, again, the ones growing in Pawnee Park, which are fairly protected from all the other trees, and they're doing quite well, and we get our beautiful fall color. Black maple is actually a subspecies of sugar maple. It is native to Iowa, not Nebraska. It's a little more heat tolerant than the sugar maples, but again, it's not as heat tolerant as, say, an oak. This one grows best in moist soil. Obviously, all trees do, but it's not as tolerant of continuously dry soil. The mature trees will be drought tolerant, and this one will tolerate heavy shade. Miyabei maple, again, it's native to Japan, but Miyabei, we keep hearing that it should be planted more. I'll be honest with you, we planted some at our new chamber office here in Columbus, and we haven't had great success with it. But it might just be that it wasn't watered well enough, because it was a low water irrigation site, and it was underneath it was planted with, gosh, I'm drawing a blank, but it's a shrub that heavily suckers, and I just think if we hadn't planted it underneath, amongst those shrubs, I think they would do better. But Morton or State Street is a selection from the Morton Arboretum in Chicago. So they had a tree from Japan, and then this is a selection that's just a little different and considered a little better quality. Good yellow fall color. I put 30 to 40 because it's a little smaller tree. Most of the shade trees I'm listing here are probably going to be in the 40 to 60 foot range eventually. And this is one where you do want to avoid dry sites. And unique leaf. It has a pretty, fairly unique leaf. All maple leaves are pretty, but I like this one. Okay, hybrid elms. Okay, we know we lost our American elms to Dutch elm disease, but there's a number of hybrid elms on the market now that are showing good Dutch elm disease resistance. So this is a good tree to bring back, to start planting to add to our diversity of trees in our communities. Elms are tough trees. That's why they were so popularly planted as a street tree. And then they have that nice base shape, which makes them a great street tree for that reason. So they're quite adapted, tough, wide range of soils. They'll tolerate wet or dry sites. Some of the newer cultivars that we recommend, most of them have yellow fall color, but Frontier is one with kind of a reddish purple fall color. The last two on there, Valley Forge and Princeton, are true American elms, and American elms are native. The picture I have is of Valley Forge, and that's at the Pierce Arboretum in Pierce, Nebraska. So if you've never been to that arboretum, it's a great place to go to walk around, and trees are labeled and see what trees there are and how they're doing. Gary Zimmer there does a great job. Okay, I kind of hesitated with whether I should put linden on here because of the Japanese beetle issue, but even though it can be appear to be a major nuisance and issue, large established trees, rarely will it kill them. So it's really more of a nuisance and can make the tree look kind of lacy and bad when there's high populations of the Japanese beetle. So I went ahead and included a couple of lindens. American linden, most of the linden trees planted are little leaf linden. They're overplanted, and they tend to have issues with girdling roots. So American elm, it's a native tree, it's a large tree, and it's considered somewhat intolerant of urban conditions. So it wouldn't make a good street tree, and it probably is not a good tree for small landscapes. Like all lindens, it has that moderate to fast growth rate. Awesome pollinator tree. They buzz in June when they're blooming. So it does have that winged tiny nutless. Some people don't like that fruit with the bract on it, but they mow up so easily. Pretty yellow fall color, tolerant of drought and clay soils. So other than the Japanese beetle issue, which again on a smaller tree you just plant, they should be knocked off into a bucket of soapy water to reduce damage and stress, or that might justify spray on a small young tree. But on large established lindens, even though they make the leaves look very lacy as in the picture, rarely are they going to kill a tree. Silver linden is not as popular. I took this picture at the Maxwell Arboretum on UNL campus, East Campus. So it's not as readily available, but it has a silver downy leaf on the underside. So that's why it's tomentosa. So it's reported to be less susceptible to Japanese beetle, that they don't like to feed on it as much because of those hairs, those downy hairs on the underside of the leaf. So I keep thinking I should ask somebody on East Campus if they are seeing much damage on this tree. And every time I say that, then I forget to ask. Same amount of flowering, great for pollinators. Of the lindens, this probably has the best drought tolerance. And even though American linden is not considered as tolerant of urban conditions as silver linden is. And I know in this picture, they've allowed those lower limbs to stay on trees and stay on this tree and grow all the way to the base. It's fine to do that. We often feel like we have to raise that lower limb for clearance, for mowing, etc. But you don't have to if you don't want to. Ginkgo, again, another tree that's not native, but it's a very, very tough tree. I'm sure most of you know that it's considered a living fossil. And by that, we mean this genus of tree grew during the dinosaur age. And I like to tell kids, what's tougher? The dinosaur are extinct, the ginkgo isn't. So obviously this tree is tougher than the dinosaurs. And I kind of get a smile from the youth. So it is a very tough tree. This is a popular street tree in New York City because it tolerates the air pollution, the poor soils, the heat island effect. So a tough tree. It is slower growing. When people say a slow growing tree, ginkgo definitely is slower growing, even if you start young and you plant small. I planted a tree about 20 years ago and it's about, might be just reaching 30 feet, 25, 30 feet. The cones, and yes, ginkgo is actually a conifer. It's a gymnosperm. So the fruit is referred to as a cone or a naked seed, and it is smelly. I'm laughing because when I moved into my house, I was given a ginkgo it was given to me as a gift, housewarming gift, and I planted it and it ended up being a female, which I didn't know until probably about 5 years ago. But that's okay. I'm fine with that. But we do tell people to plant the male cultivars in Autumn Gold and Emperor, a couple of examples. So a very interesting leaf shape, kind of fan shaped with parallel veins. Beautiful yellow fall color that, yes, almost every leaf drops at the same time. So this is a tree in my neighborhood, which is also a female. So I keep saying I'd like to find that male tree that's pollinating our female trees. So, but as you can see here, it's like almost in one day, those leaves just drop. So you only have to rake once. And I'm going to go off on a little tangent here and tell you a fun little story. I took this picture. My daughter goes to the College of St. Mary's in Omaha. It's an all-girls school. They have this pretty little courtyard where they have a gazebo and a water feature, and they always encourage the students to go back there. And I took this picture. My daughter plays soccer, which is in the fall, so I'm always there in the fall, and I like to walk back there. But the path is littered with the fruit. And I always kind of smile to myself and think, I wonder how many students walk, because when you squish these cones, I should refer to them as cones, when you squish them, that's when they get really smelly. So I kind of smile and wonder how many students walk on those, go back to their dorm room, take off their shoes, and then they're going, what is that smell? And if they figure out it's on the bottom of their shoes. So I'm sorry, just a fun little story to share with you on Friday. Okay, Kentucky coffee tree. This is a tree that should definitely be planted much more. What do I mean by ugly duckling? Well, I had a nurseryman here in Columbus tell me, he said, I love Kentucky coffee trees, but they have no curb appeal in the garden center. We have a hard time getting people to buy them because they kind of look like just a little stick in the container. And people want to buy something that's started to branch out. So I will often tell people that, you know, just be aware that it might be an ugly duckling when you buy it, but it'll grow into a beautiful swan. Tough tree, tolerant of poor soils, drought. It does not like heavy clay. So it's not a great tree if you have heavy clay, poorly drained. Large compound leaf. Okay. I love taking these into the classroom and showing, this is one leaf. That's a picture of one leaf. So I like to hold it up and tell all the students, you're looking at one leaf. And that entire thing came out of one bud. It's just made up of numerous leaflets. These can have up to 90 leaflets. But sometimes the homeowner, when they start to drop their leaves, they think it's messy because they think it's a lot of little twigs dropping. But it's really just the petio of this large leaf, and they mow up, rake up very readily. Pretty yellow fall color, as you saw. The seed pods cling on the tree into the winter to add some winter interest. Okay, it's called coffee tree because yes, the pioneers would roast the beans and make coffee if they couldn't get real coffee. No caffeine, and I hear it didn't taste very well. But know that the seeds themselves before roasting can be highly toxic. So sometimes people, well, they used to eat these for coffee, I'm just going to pop one in and chew on it. But if it's not roasted, it's highly toxic. And they're not messy. When these pods drop, they're easy to pick up, break up. I collect them and I save them to take into the schools and so on. I don't leave them there. I take them back home. Okay, Ohio buckeye, another native tree. It's a little smaller tree. I'd say 30 feet in most urban settings. And again, a tree, if you plant it in the ideal location, open, it's not an urban setting, some of these trees can get much taller. But in some of our urban settings, especially, they're probably not going to reach their maximum height. But this one is usually a little smaller tree. All parts of a buckeye and the seed itself is toxic, so be aware of that. It has a pretty bloom, as you can see here in the picture. In April and May. These, we want to avoid fairly dry sites because these leaves can scorch. Now I will say we have these growing in our park in Columbus on sandy soil, no irrigation. And they're not very tall, but they do seem to do well. They are probably because they're drought tolerant. They're also shade tolerant, so they can be used as an understory tree. Pretty yellow fall color. They can be difficult to transplant, just like some of the oaks. They will develop a taproot, so you want to plant them when they're young. These are just not trees where you want to go in with a tree spade and move a large tree or start with too tall of a tree. Start young enough, plant it correctly, and we'll have good success. Okay, horse chestnut. Again, this is another one that's not native. Okay, and I have seen where some states, not very many, very few states, kind of listed as invasive. And some states will list trees that are invasive just because they're not native. Okay. So I still recommend it, but just an FYI to people. It blooms in May. It has a little prettier bloom. These horse chestnut, it's not a chestnut. It's related to Ohio buckeye. Okay, so the nut is toxic too. So don't let that word chestnut confuse you. So, but it does have pretty blooms. This is a tree growing in the Maxwell Arboretum in Lincoln. And even though it was very pretty in bloom, my picture doesn't show that very well, but you can see how many flowers are on that, and they're very showy. So this is one, we don't want to grow it in very dry sites because it too can have scorched foliage. Probably more so than Ohio buckeye. I think Ohio buckeye will tolerate those dry soils with no scorch, just on my experience of the ones we have growing in our park. A lot of people confuse Ohio buckeye and horse chestnut. The number one way to tell the difference is the husk on the horse chestnut is spiny, and also their buds are sticky. This is a red horse chestnut that's also growing in the Maxwell Arboretum in Lincoln. It's also not native. O'Neill is this, the particular picture I have here is of O'Neill, which is hard to find. Briati is another cultivar of red horse chestnut that is, that's popular, a little bit easier to find. Again, you want to have, you know, moist soil or the leaves can scorch, and it too is toxic. And it'll be a smaller tree. It won't grow into as large of a tree as a horse chestnut. It'll be more similar to Ohio Buckeye, but very pretty blooms. I know they have these growing in the Henry Dorley Zoo in Omaha, and that's a pretty urban heat island, and they seem to be doing okay there. Okay, great trees that we should plant a little more of are our native hickories, shagbark and bitternut, even pecan. I don't have pecan on here, but pecan is in this family, this genus. And the northern pecans are good trees, good shade trees we should plant more of. They do have an edible nut. See, they can get huge. They can get very tall, taller than some trees. So you might want to think twice in a small yard. These will tolerate clay soil, high drought tolerance once established. Pretty fall color. And again, a lot of the nut trees can develop a taproot, so as they get older, so they're tough to transplant. If you transplant a larger one, start smaller. Bitternut hickory. I have to stop and think for a minute because there's the stop share, etc. is covering up my names, but I know what my trees are. So another native. This is considered the most adaptable hickory, at least for eastern Nebraska, so it should do great in Iowa. Relatively fast growing. Same reason as the shagbark, start small. Like any tree, it'll do best in moist soil. And the nut, this nut is, it's not toxic. It's called bitternut because of the bitter compounds. So it's unpalatable and not one great shade tree, but if you're planting it for yourself to eat, harvest and eat the nuts, go with shagbark instead of bitternut. Okay, this is a little different tree. This is another one that I decided to plant last year. So I'm curious to see how it grows because we don't have a lot of them around. But Yellowwood, this one has a fragrant May bloom. And you can see it is in a legume. So it does have those pea-shaped blossoms. But it can take about 8 to 10 years before the tree will bloom. And like a lot of spring blooming trees, those flower buds can be killed by frost. So you won't consistently have those pretty flowers. It'll get a small fruit pod that's similar to redbud. So not a nuisance, not very messy. This is like sugar maple. This is one that should be planted where it's protected from strong winds, drying winds. Once it's established, it'll tolerate dry soils fairly well. It bleeds heavily when pruned. That does not hurt the tree in any way, shape, or form, but it scares people. So we'll often tell people to prune it in June to avoid that sap loss. Again, that does not hurt the tree. We need to get away from that word bleed. So that makes it sound bad. Pretty yellow fall color, and it's named Yellowwood because the wood actually has a yellow dye in it. Okay, my last tree. Okay, then we'll go to questions if there are any. This is black cherry, and I'm talking about shade trees, so why black cherry? This is native to Nebraska and Iowa, but it's a large cherry tree, okay? 40 to 50 feet. It has pretty glossy leaves. It'll bloom with your traditional prunus blossom, about April and May. This is a tree that's very attractive to songbirds because of the fruits. So if that is a goal that you have, just maybe don't plant it over a patio or a driveway where the fruit or the birds eating the fruit will be maybe making a mess. The fruit, for humans, it's not real edible off the tree, but it's certainly edible. You can make jams and jellies out of it. This is another one that does better if you transplant, start with a smaller tree, and it is good fall color. I've never actually seen the fall color on this, but it's described as yellow to rosy. And I do have a master gardener in Columbus that grows this tree, and I know he likes it, and he recommends it. Okay, so I hope I gave you some the names of some trees you already have planted, so you know we consider them a quality tree. And then the names of some other trees that sometimes they're not as readily available at our local garden centers. But the garden centers, if they're smart business people, they're going to carry what the customer asks for, right? So if we start asking for some of these other trees, maybe we can get them to start carrying some of them. So, but the importance is select right and plant it right, and then prune it right. And I'd be happy to do a tree pruning talk for you if you guys feel you ever need it. So, but I love this from our extension master gardeners. This was a new word for me, sitherism. So the sound of wind in the trees, including the rustling of leaves. So isn't that a fun word to learn today? If you follow the extension master gardeners on the Facebook, you may have seen this already, but this came on about a year ago. So I think I will stop sharing and we will see if we have any questions.
Kelly, we do have a question. Don asks, if a large maple tree is showing signs of wetwood bacteria, how concerned should I be about the affected branch falling?
Well, the tree, I'm not sure what bacterial disease you would have. So I think I would get it positively identified as to what the disease might be. But as a general rule, I mean, first the branch has to be killed, okay, and die. And then once they die, they usually have to, they start to become brittle and you might get decay in them. And the longer they're there, the higher the risk a dead branch will fail in a windstorm, ice storm, and it may not take as long. But the longer it's there. But I'm a little confused on what you mean by bacteria. It's showing signs of bacteria. If you mean it's showing fungus growth, like maybe fungal growth, like you're seeing mushrooms growing on it, that usually is an indication that there's probably some pretty good decay in the tree. Some of it depends on the type of mushroom, okay? But if it's dead and it's been dead long enough that you're seeing some fungal decay, some fungal growth, fungal fruiting bodies like mushrooms, that dead branch should be removed. And any dead branch, the sooner we remove it, the better.
Don, I'm going to unmute you if you could explain a little more.
Yeah, I'm reading it. I see where she wrote it. It's wetwood. Okay.
Wetwood bacteria. Yes.
Yeah, wetwood. There's a lot of trees. It is a bacterial, and a lot of trees do have wetwood. Some of them can go along and live fine if it's one branch, and removing that branch won't harm the structure of the tree too much, the aesthetics of the tree too much. You could go ahead and remove it to be on the safe side, but bacterial wetwood, a lot of trees have this and live with it. A forester one time told me if you see, let's say you see something on the tree that concerns you, take the flat side of a hammer or even an axe and just kind of tap around it. If it sounds really hollow, you probably have a problem.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You still don't know, but just definitely monitor it. And you might want to ask a forester sometime.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Kelly, we do have another question. What do you think of a catalpa tree?
I love catalpa trees. I think they should be planted. They're large, they're coarse, beautiful flowers, large leaves. So they're probably not a good tree for a small yard, but I have no issue with planting them. One of the issues we see in them, like after a drought year, stress years, we'll see verticillium wilt, which is a disease that at least can cause branch dieback or maybe kill the tree, but it's pretty rare. We don't see a lot of it. So if you like those really large leaves, they're beautiful flowers, yep, I'd plant catalpa.
In between questions, I just thought I would remind people to fill out the evaluation. So the link's in the chat. I'm just about to send it again here. So if you want to make sure to copy that and fill that out later.
if you do have a question, go ahead and write it in the chat. I know some of you have said last week that it was difficult to find the chat area. On a computer, if you go down to the bottom of the screen and take your mouse down there, you should have a bar that will come up, and in that will be a little box with chat written underneath it. And if you click on that, that's where you can go to write it. And I do see one more question.
Yeah, I see the question too. So a lot of the trees that I talked about today can be planted in smaller yards. I was going to cover some smaller trees, but I was worried about running out of time. But some of the trees I was going to cover were Japanese tree lilac, ironwood, American hop hornbeam, or cork tree, although one of those trees is considered, some states they consider it invasive. I'm drawing a blank on which one it is. Machia. You know, the hawthorns, there's some good hawthorns. There's a lot of variety in hawthorns. Again, those are smaller, those would be considered smaller ornamental trees. That probably the Japanese tree lilac is an American hop hornbeam. American hornbeam, they're actually two separate trees. They're gonna get maybe up to 30 feet. And of course, the hawthorns would be more like 20, 25. Caitlin, do you have some smaller trees you recommend a lot for Iowa?
I think that's about the same list. I know, I think ironwood might be that invasive one because I know I've had to take it out a couple times in conservation practices. So
yeah, I think you're right. As I said it, I'm going, one of those is, you know, a good source. If you're wondering about a tree, a source I use, I like to go to the Missouri Botanical Garden website. A lot of times I'll just type in ironwood plus Mobot, and it'll take you to the plant finder, and you'll bring it up, and they do a great job. It'll be in red, and it'll say, where is this tree invasive in the US? And you click on it, and if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see a map, and it'll show you where it's considered invasive. And just because it's considered invasive someplace in the United States does not mean it's a bad tree for a local area. So invasive is not the same as noxious. There's noxious weeds, and then there's noxious plants, and there's invasive. So invasive in one state, that plant or tree might be considered a great tree in another state. But the Botanical Garden is a good resource for, they do keep up on that very well.
Kelly, would you find that on your screen and then share it with us so we could all see that?
Okay, let me minimize here. I just typed in Mobot, MOBOT.org. Okay, I'm gonna have to go back out and share. Let's see. Okay. Are you seeing it okay?
We are. We did have somebody ask about a specific tree if it was invasive. So would you put in Siberian elm and we can actually see what's going on with it?
Yeah, I'll do Siberian elm plus Mobot. Ulmus pumila, plant finder. Yeah, and that's that. If you noticed, I had Siberian elm on my avoid planting. Okay, Siberian elm is the tree that almost everybody calls Chinese elm. Chinese elms are wonderful, beautiful trees. We should plant more of, a smaller tree. We have them in our park in Columbus, and they do great, beautiful bark. So just know that Siberian elm is what most people call Chinese elm. So yeah, it shows here, red. Now you won't always have this red, but a lot of times you'll have this, where is this species invasive? Click on it. And talks about Siberian elm, helps with identification. And if you go to the bottom, you can see the map. Okay, it says this map is incomplete. Okay, and this is where the species is reported. Okay. So hopefully that was helpful. But I think, Missouri Botanical Garden does a great job of that. I'm sure other botanical gardens might as well, but that's this one, the Minnesota Arboretum and the Morton Arboretum, I think are probably as close to our growing environment. So that's usually resources that I will use if I can't find it locally. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kelly.